I found the alien queen's daughter injured in a forest. She was hiding a dangerous secret. The transmitter on Ridge 7 had been silent for 6 days before anyone in the survey office bothered to be concerned about it. And even then the concern was less about the transmitter itself than about the paperwork its silence generated. Thomas had been the one to draw the assignment, mostly because he was the one standing nearest the duty board when the notification chimed, which he privately considered one of the great injustices of frontier employment. Proximity to a clipboard should not constitute a binding contract, and yet here he was, 3 days later, hiking into a stretch of forest his maps only pretended to understand. Keth 9 Northern Continent did not get many visitors, human or otherwise, and the forest reflected that indifference back at him in every direction. The trees grew taller than they had any right to, canopies knitting together so thickly overhead that the light came down in coin-sized patches, and the undergrowth had the particular density of vegetation that has never once had to consider the needs of a person carrying survey equipment. Thomas's boots had absorbed enough mud in the last hour that he suspected they now qualified as a separate ecosystem. "You'd think," he said, to nobody, because there was nobody, that a transmitter important enough to put in a maintenance ticket would be important enough to put somewhere a person could actually reach it. The forest did not respond. The forest rarely did, which Thomas had decided early into this posting was either the best or worst thing about it, depending on his mood. Today his mood was somewhere in the territory of resigned amusement. The specific flavor that comes from accepting a task is going to be unpleasant and choosing to narrate the unpleasantness aloud rather than suffer it in dignified silence. Dignified silence had never been his strong suit. His last performance review had used the phrase, "communicates findings enthusiastically," which he'd understood at the time to be a polite way of telling him to shut up occasionally, and had ignored accordingly. His handheld chirped, the signal from Ridge 7 flickering weakly into range, and then dropping again, a stuttering little pulse that told him he was close but not close enough, and that whatever was wrong with the transmitter was wrong enough to make even its dying signal unreliable. He adjusted his course east, off the marked trail and into terrain the map, rendered with the kind of vague dotted lines that surveyors used when they meant "we assume this is here," but have not personally verified it. It was not, strictly speaking, his job to verify it today. It was his job to find a transmitter. The dotted lines were someone else's problem, a someone else who, Thomas reflected, was probably also standing near a duty board somewhere, blissfully unaware of how close they'd come to ankle-deep mud. He found the clearing before he found the transmitter, which struck him immediately as backward. There should have been a relay tower first, a squat gray cylinder bolted into rock the way all of them were, ugly and reliable and entirely without charm. Instead there was a fallen tree, enormous, the kind of old growth that didn't fall on its own without a very good reason, and a scorch pattern along its trunk that made Thomas's stomach do something unpleasant before his brain had finished processing why. And then he saw her. She was against the base of the fallen tree, half shadowed by its root mass, and his first coherent thought, once his brain caught up with the fact that there was, in fact, a person here and not a particularly convenient pile of forest debris, was that someone had gotten extremely creative with a costume. His second thought, arriving a half-second later and with considerably more urgency, was that the blood was not part of any costume. "Okay," he said, out loud, mostly to give himself a moment to think while his legs had already decided to move without consulting him. "Okay, hi. I'm not going to startle you, I'm just going to." She was awake, which he registered with relief, and watching him with an attention that had nothing relieved about it at all. Her eyes tracked him the way a person tracks something they haven't yet decided is a threat, which was, Thomas thought, a perfectly reasonable way to look at a stranger who has just crashed through the underbrush talking to himself. What stopped him mid-stride knees half bent in the universal posture of a man trying to look harmless while approaching an injured stranger, were her ears long, tapering elegantly back from her temples in a way that no amount of mud or shadow could make look human, and that told him, with the particular clarity of a fact arriving fully formed and unannounced, that whatever this assignment had been about 5 minutes ago, it was not that anymore. "I have a field kit," he said, holding up the bag as evidence, as though it might serve as a passport into a conversation neither of them had agreed to have yet. "Medical, I'm not. I work for the survey office. I was looking for a transmitter." He paused. "This is not the transmitter." Her breathing was careful in a way that made his chest hurt a little just watching it. Slow and metered, the kind of breath a person takes when they have decided, somewhere below conscious thought, that pain is a problem to be managed rather than an emergency to be announced. She didn't say anything. Her gaze flicked briefly past his shoulder to the tree line behind him and held there a half-second longer than it should have before coming back. "Right," Thomas said, mostly to fill the silence, because silence in situations like this had never sat well with him. "I'm going to take that as permission, since you haven't thrown anything at me yet, which I'm choosing to interpret generously." He crouched, slow, kit open, hands visible the entire time in the manner of a man diffusing not a bomb but a deeply justified suspicion. "I'm Thomas, by the way. I'd shake your hand, but you look like shaking anything right now is a bad idea, so we'll skip it. Pretend I did. Pretend it was very firm and professional." Something in her expression shifted, fractional, the muscles around her mouth doing something that on a human face he would have called the ghost of a smirk arriving and immediately thinking better of itself. "That's progress," Thomas said. "I'll take it." He worked the way he always worked under pressure, which was to ask only what he needed to know right now and let the rest sit until later. "Where does it hurt? Can you move this? Is there more blood than I'm seeing?" And not, despite every instinct clawing at the back of his throat. "Who did this to you? Or why does the air around that scorched tree still smell like an electrical fire? Or why do your ears look like that? And does the survey office have a protocol for this? Because I skimmed the first contact manual, and I am almost certain none of the diagrams covered field dressing." Those questions could wait. The bleeding could not. She let him work, which he understood, somewhere underneath the immediate business of pressure and antiseptic, was its own kind of answer, not trust, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a calculation made and a risk accepted because the alternative was worse. Her eyes kept drifting to the tree line. Thomas kept talking, low and steady, about nothing in particular, the mud, the transmitter. A story about a survey drone that had once fallen in love with a rock formation and refused to stop circling it. Because he had the growing suspicion that whatever she was watching for in those trees, his voice was the only thing currently keeping her from watching it too closely. And he was, if nothing else, willing to be useful in whatever strange and small way the day required of him. The shelter Thomas rigged was, by any reasonable engineering standard, an embarrassment. He'd strung the survival tarp between the fallen tree's root mass and a sapling that was clearly unenthusiastic about being recruited for structural duty, and the resulting linta sagged in the middle in a way that made it look less like shelter and more like the tarp had simply given up partway through trying. He stood back to admire his work, hands on hips, with the specific pride of a man who knows the thing he built is bad but is choosing to feel good about it anyway. "In my professional opinion," he said, "that's load-bearing." She looked at the tarp. She looked at him. The look she gave the tarp was, if anything, slightly more trusting. "It survived me standing under it," Thomas said. "That's the only certification this region offers. Frontier engineering, if it hasn't collapsed yet, it's structurally sound." He crouched to check the dressing on her side, the one that had been bleeding through faster than the others, and was relieved to find it holding. "You're lucky I came this way, by the way. I want that on record. I was supposed to be checking a transmitter, and instead I get to play field medic to someone who looks like she stepped out of a recruitment poster for a species I've never met. I feel like I should be charging overtime. You talk, she said, the first words she'd offered since he'd found her, low and a little rough. The way water moves when it can't decide which way is downhill. Thomas sat back on his heels, genuinely delighted. That's either the nicest or the meanest thing anyone said about me this year, and I genuinely can't tell which I think says more about my year than about you. The corner of her mouth did the thing again, the almost smile that kept arriving and reconsidering itself, and Thomas decided to count it as a small victory and move on before she could take it back. He busied himself boiling water over a portable heat cell, the kind of task that gave his hands something to do while his head worked through the much larger problem of what, exactly, he was supposed to report when he eventually made it back within range of a working relay. Found transmitter destroyed. Also found a woman with ears like a fairy tale illustration, and several injuries that look suspiciously deliberate. Advise. He suspected the survey office did not have a form for this. He suspected, increasingly, that nobody did. Eat something, he said, holding out a ration bar with the enthusiasm of a man presenting a gift he knows is terrible. Fair warning, it tastes like a cardboard box that's had an argument with a lemon. But it's calories, and you've lost a lot of those today, probably along with several liters of blood and at least one good night's sleep. She took it, turned it over once in her hands like she was assessing it for structural integrity in the same way he'd assessed his tarp, and bit into it. Her expression did not change so much as it committed, fully and silently, to an opinion. I told you, Thomas said. You did not tell me it would be an asterisk insult asterisk. I said cardboard and lemon. I feel like that set reasonable expectations. She stopped herself. The sentence cut off cleanly. The way a person stops when they catch themselves about to say something they hadn't planned to say, and covered the gap by taking another bite of the ration bar with the grim determination of someone proving a point to herself rather than to him. Thomas noticed the stop. He filed it away without commenting on it, the same way he'd filed away her ears, the scorch marks on the tree, and the fact that she'd flinched, 20 minutes earlier, at a sound he was fairly sure had just been a bird. You don't have to finish it, he said instead, gentler than his usual register, testing the water. I know it's bad. I've eaten worse, but only because the survey office's idea of hazard pay is letting us choose which flavor of bad ration bar we suffer through. I'll finish it. She said it like an argument she intended to win against someone who wasn't him. I need the calories. You said so yourself. I did say that. I stand by it. I just also don't want you choking to death out of spite, because then I'd have to explain that in my report. And frankly, the report is already going to be hard enough to write. That got something close to a real laugh out of her, short, surprised, like it had escaped before she'd properly decided to allow it. And Thomas felt unreasonably pleased with himself, the way he always did when he managed to make somebody laugh in a situation that had no business permitting laughter at all. He thought, not for the first time in his life, that humor was less a personality trait and more a tool, the conversational equivalent of a tarp strung badly between two unwilling trees. It wouldn't hold up forever, but it kept the worst of the weather off long enough to get something done. He changed her dressings again as the light shifted, gold going to amber going to the deep blue-gray that signaled the forest was about to get a great deal darker and a great deal less forgiving. And through all of it her eyes kept drifting, almost involuntarily, to the tree line, not constantly, not in a way that would have read as paranoia to someone less observant, but often enough, and with enough consistency in which direction, that Thomas had started to form an unwelcome little theory in the back of his mind. People watched the place danger had come from. They didn't usually watch it with quite that much dread for an animal, or a fall, or any of the ordinary explanations the terrain might have offered. "Can I ask you something?" he said, careful, And you can tell me it's none of my business, and I'll respect that mostly while internally combusting with curiosity. You may ask, your injuries. He gestured vaguely at the dressings, at the scorched bark behind her. They don't look like falling out of a tree injuries. They look like somebody did this to you injuries. And I've decided I don't actually need to know who or why, not tonight. But I'd like to know if I should be worried about that somebody finding this clearing before morning. Because if so, I'd like to reconsider my tarp's structural priorities. She was quiet for long enough that the question started to feel like it might simply go unanswered, swallowed by the dark and the distant click of insects settling into the canopy. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped the wry edge it had carried all evening, replaced by something flatter and more careful, a tone Thomas recognized immediately as the sound of someone deciding, in real time, how much truth a stranger could be trusted with. Not tonight, she said. I don't think they know where I am, not yet. That's a very specific kind of reassuring, Thomas said, in that it reassures me about tonight and absolutely nothing else. It's the only honesty I have to offer right now. Fair enough. He settled back against the root mass beside her, close enough to be useful, far enough to be polite, and looked up at the patch of sky visible through the canopy, where the first unfamiliar stars of Keth 9 night had started to surface. Then we'll deal with everything else tomorrow. Tonight, we sleep under my deeply unqualified tarp, and you finish that ration bar, and I promise not to ask any more questions you're not ready for. He paused. Today, anyway. Tomorrow I make no such promises. Morning arrived the way it tended to on Keth 9, which was to say abruptly, and without any of the gentle pink-and gold build-up Thomas remembered from Earth-nature documentaries. One moment the canopy was black, and the next it was lit from somewhere behind it in a flat, businesslike white, as though the planet had simply flipped a switch rather than bothered with a sunrise. Thomas woke up with a crick in his neck, a tarp sagging directly onto his forehead, and the distinct impression that he had not, in fact, slept so much as lost consciousness intermittently between bouts of listening for footsteps that never came. "Your tarp," she said, from somewhere to his left, in a voice that had clearly been awake and forming opinions for some time, "has been resting on your face for the last 20 minutes. "I know," Thomas said without moving. "I've made peace with it. We've reached an understanding. It gets to touch my forehead, and I get to not have to find out what's making that clicking noise in the bushes. That's a Verith beetle, it's harmless, it only eats bark. See, now I'm almost disappointed. I'd built it up into something much more dramatic in my head." He sat up finally, dislodging the tarp with the air of a man parting from an old friend, and found her watching him with an expression that had changed overnight in a way he couldn't immediately name, steadier maybe, the wariness still present but folded down into something more deliberate, like a decision that had been argued out in the dark and arrived at by morning. The bleeding had stopped. The color in her face had come back enough that she no longer looked like a person actively negotiating with her own consciousness, which Thomas took, gratefully, as a sign that the worst of the immediate danger had passed, which meant he understood with a small internal sigh that the conversation he'd been politely declining to have was about to become unavoidable. "I want to say something first," he said, "before you say whatever it is you've clearly been rehearsing since you woke up, because I could hear you not sleeping from over here, and you have the specific posture of someone who has prepared remarks." He held up a hand before she could object. "I don't need to know everything. I want that on the record. I'm a survey technician. My job, as recently as 4 days ago, was making sure a relay tower hadn't been knocked sideways by weather. I am not equipped, professionally or emotionally, for whatever you're about to tell me. But I'm going to listen anyway, because you clearly need to tell someone asterisk, and I appear to be the someone currently available." She studied him for a moment, the long line of her ear catching the flat morning light, and something in her shoulders eased fractionally, the way a held breath finally lets go. "My name," she said, "is Mia." Thomas, he said, though we did this already, technically, while you were bleeding on me, so I feel like we're past introductions and into something more like. He gestured vaguely between them. Structural reinforcement. My mother is the queen. Thomas opened his mouth to make a joke about that too, because that was simply what his mouth did under pressure, and found, for possibly the first time since this entire ordeal had started, that nothing came out. The silence stretched a beat too long to be comfortable. Okay, he said finally. I had a few guesses. Royalty was on the list. It was below escaped science experiment and above cult thing, if that helps you understand my mental ranking system. It doesn't particularly, but I appreciate that you have won. Mia drew her knees up, careful of the dressing on her side, and looked past him at the tree line the way she had all the previous evening, except now the looking had context, now it had weight. I wasn't attacked by a stranger, Thomas. I wasn't lost. I left. I ran and I got this far, and the things you treated last night happened because I ran, not before. From your own people. From what my own people are building. She said it plainly, without drama, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd whispered it. There's a research wing beneath the palace. Most of the court believes it studies agricultural resilience, crop yields, soil composition, the kind of thing that sounds important enough to fund and boring enough that no one asks follow-up questions. I believed that too, for most of my life, because believing it was easier than not. And it's not agricultural resilience. It's a weapon. Mia's hands had gone still in her lap, the particular stillness of someone holding very carefully onto the edges of a thing she didn't want to drop. Or it will be, once they finish what they're building. I found the design schematics by accident. I wasn't supposed to be in that section of the wing at all. I was looking for my mother, and I found drawings instead. The kind of technology the Alliance Treaty explicitly named, explicitly forbade, the first time Keth 9 signed onto it. I recognized the language from school. I wasn't supposed to recognize it. I don't think anyone expected the Queen's daughter to have paid that much attention in treaty studies. I'm going to need you to walk that back about 4 steps, Thomas said, because I think I just heard illegal superweapon in a sentence that started with crop yields. And my brain is doing the thing where it tries to make a joke to buy itself time to catch up, and the joke isn't coming, which is genuinely alarming for me personally. I know it sounds like the kind of thing that gets written into history books with everyone's name spelled wrong, Thomas said. And then, because the silence afterward felt like it might collapse on both of them if he let it sit too long, added, which, frankly, given my handwriting, was already going to happen to me regardless of the superweapon. That got the laugh out of her again, small and startled, the kind that seemed to surprise her every time it escaped, and Thomas held onto the sound of it like a handhold on a slope that had just gotten considerably steeper. I confronted no one, Mia continued, once the laugh had passed. I didn't have proof beyond what I'd seen, and I didn't know who else in the court already knew, which meant I didn't know who I could trust with what I'd found. So I ran instead before anyone realized I'd seen it, and I nearly made it clean. Her hand drifted briefly to the dressing at her side. Security found me at the tree line 2 days out from the palace. I don't think they were trying to kill me. I think they were trying to bring me back quietly, and quiet, apparently, allows for quite a lot of damage. Thomas sat with that for a long moment, watching the flat white light filter down through the canopy, listening to the harmless clicking of a Verith beetle that ate only bark and asked nothing of anyone, and felt the shape of the day rearrange itself entirely around the woman sitting across from him. Right, he said finally, with the particular forced brightness of a man picking up a weight he has only just realized is much heavier than it looked. So, not a transmitter problem. No, Mia agreed, not a transmitter problem. Fantastic. I'm going to need a much bigger field kit. The decision, when Thomas finally made it, did not feel like the kind of decision that belonged in history books. It felt like the kind of decision a person makes standing in mud, scratching the back of his neck, weighing a transmitter that wasn't there against a woman who very much was. "Okay," he said, mostly to himself, the way he narrated most of his important life choices. "Okay, here's what we're not going to do. We're not going to march you back to the palace through the front gate like a parcel that got returned to sender. And we're not going to sit in this clearing until the beetles file a noise complaint. So," he looked at Mia, who was watching him with the cautious attention of someone who had learned, the hard way, not to assume good outcomes. "We're going to walk out of here, find a relay that isn't full of scorch marks, and put what you know somewhere big enough that it can't be quietly tidied away. That's the job. I didn't apply for it, but apparently it's mine now." "That's a good way to get both of us killed," Mia said. "I prefer ambitious. Gives it better odds in the report." The walkout took most of the day, longer than it should have because Mia's side still pulled with every uneven step, and Thomas refused on principle to let her pretend otherwise, which led to several arguments conducted entirely through pointed looks and one memorable exchange where she accused him of fussing, and he accused her of being the worst patient he'd ever treated, a category that, he admitted, currently contained exactly one entry. The forest thinned by degrees, the canopy opening into patches of real sky, and somewhere in the second hour Thomas's handheld finally caught a clean signal. Not from Ridge 7, which he now understood with grim clarity had never malfunctioned at all, but from a relay 2 ridgelines over that hadn't been anywhere near whoever had come looking for Mia. "There it is," he said, watching the connection bars climb. Civilization, bureaucracy, the sweet, dull hum of a network that hasn't been deliberately set on fire. "You think it was deliberate?" "I think a relay tower doesn't scorch itself, no. I think whoever found you didn't want anyone calling for help, yours or mine. And I think that means whoever sent them is a great deal more organized than rogue security detail acting alone." He glanced at her, which is, I'll be honest, not the reassurance I was hoping to land on. "Welcome to my last several days." He didn't send the message immediately, not to the survey office and not to anyone else, because sending it meant deciding exactly what to say and to whom, and Thomas had learned enough in the last 3 days to know that the wrong recipient could make the message disappear as easily as it could make it matter. So they kept walking, and they talked instead, properly talked. The kind of talking that wasn't triage or confession but simply 2 people passing the time on a long walk. And Thomas found out that Mia had a truly merciless sense of humor, once she let it out from wherever she'd been keeping it, that she found his running commentary on the local flora both irritating and, against her own better judgment, funny, and that she had never, not once in her life, been allowed to be anywhere without someone watching her do it. "That's the part I keep getting stuck on," he admitted, somewhere in the 3rd hour. "Not the weapon. The weapon is terrifying, don't get me wrong. I'm choosing not to think about the weapon until I absolutely have to. I keep getting stuck on the fact that you ran into a forest with no plan, no contact, no idea who'd help you, because that was still better than staying somewhere with all the comfort and none of the trust." Mia was quiet for a few steps. It was the only direction that wasn't theirs. "Yeah," Thomas said, "I figured." By the time the relay tower came into view, squat, gray, blessedly unscorched, the light had gone the color of late afternoon, and Thomas felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has done a great deal of walking and even more thinking, neither of which he was especially built for in large quantities. He sat Mia down against the tower's base, ran a final check on her dressings with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it enough times now to stop fumbling, and opened a channel, not to the survey office in the end, but to the Alliance Compliance Office 3 systems over, the one body Mia was fairly confident hadn't been bought, bribed, or quietly looked the other way, because they were too far removed from Keth 9 court politics to have a stake in protecting it. "This is going to be the strangest incident report anyone in that office has ever filed," he said, fingers hovering over the input. "Tell them about the tarp," Mia said. "I think it deserves a mention." The tarp, Thomas said solemnly, held up under conditions no tarp should reasonably be expected to survive. "I'm putting that in writing, for the record, for history." He sent the message before he could talk himself into a different, safer, blander version of it, and felt something in his chest unclench that he hadn't fully realized was clenched at all. The response, when it came, was not immediate, and not entirely comfortable. There would be questions, official ones, the kind that came with forms and follow-ups, and almost certainly a great deal of scrutiny aimed at a survey technician who had apparently decided, on his own authority, that smuggling treaty violations into Alliance channels was within his job description. But it came, and it acknowledged her, by name and lineage, in a way that meant the secret she'd been carrying alone for days was no longer only hers to carry, which Thomas understood. Watching her shoulders drop half an inch for the first time since he'd found her, was the entire point. "They'll send someone," Mia said, reading the reply over his shoulder. "Independent, not court-appointed." "Good, I was getting tired of being your only backup. No offense, but I am extremely underqualified for this." "You did fine." "I treated a princess with a kit meant for sprained ankles and told her ration bars were lemon-flavored cardboard." "I'm not sure 'fine' is the word historians are going to land on." "It's the word I'm landing on," Mia said. And there was nothing wry in it this time, no edge, just a kind of plain and unhurried honesty that made Thomas feel, for one unguarded second, considerably more useful than he'd ever felt checking relay towers for a living. They didn't say much after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some of it didn't need saying. That whatever happened next, in courtrooms or council chambers or wherever this eventually landed, the easy part had already happened here, in a clearing with bad tarps and worse rations. Mia would face what was coming on terms that were, at last, partly her own, and Thomas would go back to his unglamorous job checking signal strength and grumbling at trees, except that now he had a story he could never fully tell anyone, not without sounding like he'd made it up. And he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't mind that one bit. Some things were worth more kept than told. He glanced over at Mia, watching the sky instead of the tree line for what looked like the first time in days, and decided that whatever the survey office eventually said about his methods, he'd done the job right.